What is it about them that you don't like?
I don't know. I just don't like them. But as far as like trying to get together and make us interact,
Yes.
it's because I really wouldn't like that. I don't like
Contradictions in the Brown family timeline, the legal divorce of Meri, and the sudden marriage of Kody to Robyn. This was not a private squabble, not a minor adjustment. It was a seismic shift that fundamentally altered the family's structure, inheritance, and power dynamics. And yet, it happened without fireworks, without confrontation, without even the bare minimum of honest dialogue. The silence was louder than any protest could have been. A family that once spent hours arguing over who parked in the wrong driveway, or whether a holiday should be celebrated at one house or another, somehow found no voice when its very foundation was rewritten. Meri's divorce from Kody was presented almost casually, as though it were a utility bill being updated, a mere formality for legal paperwork. She herself explained it in muted tones, saying she was simply stepping aside so that Kody could legally marry Robyn and ensure her children could be adopted. But beneath this convenient narrative was a layer of calculated control. Kody framed the decision as a benevolent necessity, and Robyn played the part of the grateful wife, elevated into legal standing. But the reality was different. This was not a family decision. It was a decree. The other wives were informed, not consulted. They were told after the fact, left to swallow their discomfort quietly, knowing any objection would only drive them further from Kody's already dwindling affection. Janelle, always pragmatic, raised subtle questions about what this meant for the future. Who would make decisions if something happened to Kody? Who would hold the legal power? Her trust, interestingly, was in Meri. Despite years of tension and distance, she believed Meri would act fairly in such circumstances. Robyn, however, never earned that same confidence. The distinction was telling. Janelle and Meri may not have been friends, but there was an understanding between them, a quiet loyalty that came in small but meaningful ways. Meri had shown up for Janelle in times of tragedy. Janelle had advised Meri to protect her share during property disputes. It was not closeness, but it was trust, and in a plural marriage defined by competition, that trust was invaluable. But then came the breach that shattered what little security remained. Meri, the same woman Janelle believed would safeguard her interests, disclosed to Kody and Robyn that Janelle had privately consulted a lawyer. This was not some careless slip. It was betrayal. It was handing over ammunition to the very people who had consistently manipulated the system in their favor. By breaking Janelle's confidence, Meri effectively aligned herself with Kody and Robyn, reinforcing the power imbalance and deepening the fractures among the wives. It was not just disloyalty, it was complicity, and it revealed the quiet truth. Loyalty in this family had become transactional, constantly reshaped by proximity to Kody's approval. The legal marriage to Robyn did more than shift paperwork, it cemented Robyn's dominance. Unlike Meri and Janelle, who had endured years of subtle dismissal, Robyn quickly became the unquestioned favorite. She received Kody's time, his intimacy, his resources. She did not carry the burdens that Christine once shouldered, nor did she have to prove her worth the way Meri once did. Instead, she arrived, demanded attention, and was handed the crown. The other wives were left orbiting a man who increasingly had no interest in them, watching from the sidelines as the woman they barely knew was vaulted above them. The imbalance was no longer emotional, it was legal, undeniable, permanent. And yet, no dramatic reckoning ever followed. Christine, visibly unsettled, managed to keep her reaction measured. Janelle, still in Kody's relatively good graces, only voiced mild concern. Meri, the architect of her own displacement, spoke as though it was a sacrifice made for the greater good. In reality, it was the first domino in a chain of betrayals that would eventually collapse the illusion of unity entirely. The silence of that moment reveals the heart of the dysfunction. This was never a family built on true equality. It was built on control, on carefully managed perceptions, and on wives conditioned to accept their own erasure in exchange for a fleeting sense of belonging. When Meri chose to hand over her marriage, she believed she was doing something selfless, something spiritual. But in truth, it was a calculated reordering of power, and when she later betrayed Janelle's confidence, it became clear that she was not simply a victim of the system, she was a participant in it. Robyn's role as the legal wife may have been justified with adoption papers and technicalities, but beneath the surface it was about control, favoritism, and the steady dismantling of solidarity among the original wives. Janelle's trust in Meri was not misplaced because she was naive. It was misplaced because Meri herself was caught between desperation for Kody's attention and resentment toward the women who once shared her struggle. The irony is sharp. The woman who once seemed like the safest bet became the very one who handed Robyn and Kody the keys to consolidate their dominance. This is where the true tragedy lies. It was not in the divorce papers or the legal marriage license. It was in the silence that followed, in the failure to confront, in the acceptance of betrayal as just another cost of surviving in Kody's orbit. The wives were not partners, they were pawns, and every move made, every betrayal revealed, every silence maintained only served to reinforce Kody's central power and Robyn's secured throne. The story of Meri's divorce and Robyn's elevation is not about legal logistics. It is about manipulation disguised as necessity, betrayal masked as sacrifice, and silence weaponized to maintain control. And in that silence, the entire illusion of sisterhood began to collapse, one quiet betrayal at a time. The story opens with a contradiction so stark it feels engineered for television, yet it lands with the chill of something much colder than scripted drama. A father loses a son, and the cameras capture a man seemingly more shaken by the crumbling image of his marriages than by the shattering finality of death. That is the unsettling axis of this report. Kody Brown's public response to Garrison's passing sits beside his televised obsession with marital optics, and the gap between the two pulses with questions about empathy, control, and the brand of selective vulnerability that reality television can both expose and camouflage. The larger theme is emotional triage inverted. The most urgent wound is treated like a footnote, while the salvage operation for reputation and relational pecking orders becomes the headline. Around that axis turns a second engine, the long, slow desiccation of intimacy inside a house that marketed itself as sisterhood. Years without closeness for Meri, a sexless marriage confession from Christine, nights redistributed like resources on a spreadsheet, and the steady, privileged insulation of Robyn. Taken together, these twin themes, grief handled like PR and intimacy rationed like currency, tell a single story about power. How it's hoarded, how it gaslights, how it rewrites reality, and how the quiet competition between wives masked a system where love was operationalized, controlled, and finally weaponized. To understand the present, start with the small moments that didn't feel small at the time. The offhand remarks about rotation schedules, the low-energy acknowledgement of milestones, the sudden intensity whenever the narrative threatened to drift away from the patriarch's preferred storyline. Before any tragedy, there were patterns. Kody's emotional bandwidth expanded or contracted according to proximity to his favored household. Robyn's orbit received more attention, more defense, more public justification. Other wives were offered virtue lectures and austerity measures. The first beat in our timeline is not the tragedy itself. It is the pre-existing emotional economy that explains why the tragedy would later appear oddly minimized. Years before we're watching for evidence of grief, we're watching for evidence of fairness, and what we keep seeing instead is management, of optics, of loyalty, of silence. Next, the system reveals its rules through intimacy. Meri speaks openly about a desert that lasted more than a decade, and nothing explodes, because the explosion already happened in slow motion. People normalize almost anything if the cost of noticing is exile. Christine, at first a true believer, names her reality out loud: a sexless marriage, a lonely bed, a husband who can rhapsodize about principle while shrinking from the bodily truth of neglect. She tests the air, finds it breathable, and decides that breathing is not betrayal. The inverse is more telling. Kody does not describe his desire as absent. He describes compliance as absent. If you are not performing the script I want, then intimacy is off the table. That is not romance. It is control. And control that masquerades as principle is just control with better lighting. Meanwhile, Robyn functions like a narrative safe room, a place where affection is not scarce, where the patriarch doesn't feel questioned, where the cameras find the angle that still looks like a victory lap. In any hierarchy, affection becomes a ration, and rationing creates a black market. Wives bargain with compliance, attention, and silence. Sisterhood, in this configuration, is not solidarity. It is a ceasefire, brokered by fear of losing even the crumbs. Now the tragedy arrives, and this is the fulcrum of our analysis. A son is gone. Grief, in any ordinary home, rearranges the furniture of the soul. It makes speech thick, makes cameras an insult, makes tidy narratives impossible. But here, in the recorded fragments we're allowed to see, the tone feels misaligned, like auto-tune applied to a funeral hymn. Public sorrow is muted while energy still bleeds into talking points about failed marriages, perceived disloyalty, and the logistics of moving forward with a brand. That misalignment is not proof of inner emptiness. No one but a parent knows the cavern that opens after such a loss. But it is proof of priorities in the part of life they continue to televise. Television is a knife that sharpens whatever it points at. When it points at damage control monologues more than at the incomprehensible absence of a child, the audience will connect the dots. That isn't the audience being cruel. It's the production handing them a ruler and asking them to measure. A clinical lens helps here. Look at sequences, not statements. Immediately after the loss, what gets amplified? What becomes the spine of episodes and promos? When a father's most animated on-camera posture is frustration over loyalty or glee at hypotheticals about new romance, viewers infer emotional triage. The marriages, the hierarchy, the future wives. These are the fires he appears to fight with urgency. The death, the irreversible rupture, receives solemn acknowledgments, but not the raw deconstruction you'd expect if the cameras were truly committed to something beyond continuity. On the editorial timeline, grief becomes a soft focus montage while power maintenance remains in 4K. That's not only dissonant, it's a signal. It says, this machine must keep moving, even if the fuel is denial. To see how denial protects power, return to intimacy as currency. For years, Meri was stranded in a relationship that no longer recognized her as a partner. She didn't need a press release to read the schedule on the wall. The absence was a memo that never stopped delivering itself. Christine tracks the same pattern later and refuses to wait for her name to be quietly erased from the rotation. She asks a direct question, "Are we intimate or not?" and receives a definitive no. If you are told you are unwanted, you are not obligated to keep paying rent in a house that refuses to call you a resident. The moment she closed that door, the narrative pivoted to her alleged betrayal, not his admitted withdrawal. That's textbook gaslighting. Invert cause and effect, shame the boundary setter, and put the emotional labor of reconciliation on the person who finally spoke the forbidden sentence. This isn't love. Gaslighting isn't just lying, it's destabilizing someone's ability to name reality. Within that fog, control feels like clarity, and the controller looks like the only adult in the room. What does this have to do with grief? everything. Systems that police intimacy also police which emotions are allowed to be legible. Rage at disobedience remains permissible. Tears for an unwanted wife look like weakness. Under that code, public sorrow for a child can be curated into safe frames, while performative anger at betrayals becomes the sanctioned catharsis. That is how hypocrisy hides in plain sight. The patriarch insists on stoic principles when the subject is loss, and demands fervent loyalty performances when the subject is himself. The moral geometry bends so consistently toward self-preservation that viewers start to wonder whether the only real sin in this house is disobedience to a shifting standard. Layer in production dynamics, and the picture clarifies further. A show that has weathered over a decade of narrative arcs learns to sand down what cannot be integrated. Real grief is not a subplot, it's a cancellation. So the edit tilts toward continuity, sober acknowledgement, dignified cutaways, brisk transitions into the familiar conflicts that guarantee engagement. When you ask why grief appears minimized, one answer is human: requests for privacy, boundaries amidst unbearable pain. Another answer is structural. The show has to be about something, and it is rarely about what cannot be fixed. The machine isn't built to stop, it's built to spin. And spinning requires plot. Who's loyal, who's defiant, who's angling for status, who's pushing a boundary. In that rotation, a dead sun cannot be allowed to become the sun. The orbit would collapse. So the cameras keep circling safer gravity, marriages, money, property, and the next move that keeps the seasons coming. Meanwhile, the wives' competition remains the constant drumline beneath every scene. Call it the scarcity protocol. If affection is limited, access becomes a contest. Robyn never truly competes because the system is calibrated around her already. She is the fixed point. Meri and Christine live with the dull humiliation of watching their standing measured by an intimacy ledger they no longer can influence. Janelle walks the tightrope of pragmatism, trying to negotiate respect without staging a revolution. In that environment, even acts of basic self-care look like rebellion. Christine's exit becomes high treason. Meri's independent purchase of a property reads like mutiny. The message is clear: independence without permission is framed as betrayal, while neglect without apology is framed as principle. That is not sisterhood. It is a monarchy with multiple queens consort and a single sovereign. And in monarchies, romance is policy. There is also the theology of it all, the celestial calculus that turns wives and children into spiritual capital. When your worldview codes accumulation as righteousness, intimacy becomes a harvest and fatherhood a franchise. That logic can make brutality sound holy. It's not abandonment, it's stewardship. It's not favoritism, it's the order of things. But the order keeps revealing itself as a map of the patriarch's preferences, not a map of mutual flourishing. You can hear it in the language of standards, compli, earn, prove, verbal tollbooths that women must pass to receive basic tenderness. Tenderness, rationed as reward, is not tenderness, it's leverage. When leverage becomes the primary tool, you don't just get lonely wives, you get children who learn that proximity to power matters more than truth. In that school, grief becomes just another subject to manage, not a reality that rearranges the syllabus. The timeline accelerates once one wife refuses the scarcity game. Christine's clarity is the most dangerous thing in the house because it refuses the exchange rate. She stops paying with silence. She refuses the gaslight. She does not file for a transfer. She resigns from the system. The patriarch's response is telling: disbelief, then anger, then revisionist history. "I didn't love you anyway" is the last refuge of the dethroned. It's not a confession. It's a smokescreen, an attempt to reduce a woman's exit to a tantrum she finally outgrew. But the audience can do math. Years of childcare, of cooking, of emotional logistics, of anchoring holidays and crises. That is love in action, even if it was not returned in kind. When the exit arrives, it is not betrayal. It is self-rescue. And self-rescue is the one plot twist the monarchy cannot monetize without also indicting itself. Return now to the loss of Garrison, and watch how the system behaves under pressure. In a healthy family, even a broken one, death suspends the rules. Enemies call truces. Grudges melt. The center is grief, and everyone walks toward it. Here, the production keeps its choreography. Cut to confessional, insert reference to past slights, float the possibility of a new wife, pivot to logistics. The viewer sits with the whiplash and names it for what it is. Detachment so polished it feels like strategy. That's when the ugliest question arises, the one no father should ever have to face on television. Is the performance of composure protecting you, or protecting the show? The compassionate answer is that the line between those two is now impossible to untangle. The brutal answer is that the edit made it look like the show won. If you track the wives' responses across this same window, you notice something quieter but more profound. Grief creates unlikely corridors. Women who competed for crumbs begin to speak to one another without asking permission. Their daughters marry men who treat them like equals. New households organize around mutuality, not management. The future keeps sneaking into the present, and it looks nothing like the scarcity protocol. That sight, of daughters insisting on joy, of ex-wives insisting on dignity, is the real existential threat to the old order. Because once you see that love can be abundant, you stop playing the ration game. The ration game needs your fear more than it needs your faith. A word about hypocrisy, because it sits like a watermark across the footage. Hypocrisy is not simply failing your own rules, it is weaponizing the rules when they benefit you and abandoning them when they don't. For years, the public code demanded modesty in body and behavior, restraint in affection, suspicion toward anything that looked like worldly indulgence. Then came the whiskey bar. Then came softened stances when convenience required it. None of that would be scandalous if it were named honestly, but selective scruples function like camouflage. Purity when policing women, flexibility when excusing the patriarch. That double standard does not cause grief, but it does explain the ecosystem where grief can be curated without ever threatening the power that curates it. As we reach the present moment in the timeline, the narrative pretends to reset. There are new confessions, new promises of rebuilding, new nods toward reconciliation. But reconciliation without repentance is just rebranding. You cannot repair a house by repainting the door you never walked through. Until the system names its core offenses, control dressed as covenant, gaslighting dressed as guidance, favoritism dressed as fate, any path forward will circle back to the same roundabout. The audience senses this, which is why the most compelling scenes are not the patriarch's monologues, but the quiet revolutions of women who stop asking for permission to exist. So the question that lingers after the credits is not whether Kody can find another wife, or whether the brand can survive another season. The question is what grief will do when it is finally allowed to be bigger than the show. Grief is not an editor. It does not cut to confessional. It does not respect reputation. It knocks the furniture over and invites you to leave the mess until you've learned how to sit with it. If the family ever grants grief that authority, the machine will slow, maybe even stop. But something truer might start. Fathers walking toward their children, instead of toward a camera. Women building homes that do not require them to vanish to be valued. Affection that is not a prize for good behavior, but a practice that survives disagreement, loss, and change. And yet, the pull of the machine remains strong. There are contracts. There are audiences. There is the narcotic of being seen. You can tell yourself that you are husbanding a legacy when you are merely curating a feed. You can tell yourself you are protecting the family when you are protecting the brand. But brands cannot mourn for you, and they will not hold you when the house is quiet and the absence is loud. Only people can do that. People require time and truth, and the courage to say what the system forbids. I was wrong. I was cruel. I was afraid. I'm ready to stop performing and start becoming. If that sentence ever lands on camera, The season will finally become a story worth keeping. If it never lands, the story will keep eating itself, devouring new plotlines to avoid the old confession. Here is the final beat for now, not a conclusion but a reckoning deferred. A father's blank space where grief should glow is not a verdict on his heart. It is a mirror held up to the architecture he built. If the mirror keeps showing detachment, the fix is not a new speech or a new wife. The fix is demolition. Remove the rationing, end the scarcity protocol, stop the gaslighting, retire the throne. Let intimacy be unbribed. Let sorrow be undirected. Let love be unperformed. Only then will the next frame feel honest enough to hold what has already happened, and humane enough to shelter what might yet be healed. Thanks for watching.